Our last speaker of the day will be Dr. Bryan Kolb. He's delivered decades of research and education experience to the U of L committee. I'm very proud to call him one of my colleagues in arts and science. And I've actually gotten the chance to both learn from him in a classroom setting as an undergrad, as well as work with him now being a faculty member on several initiatives that we were both involved in. He was born in Calgary, so he's an Albertan, and he was currently a professor in the Department of Neuroscience at the U of L. He's been there since 1976. He received his BSc and MSc from the University of Calgary and his PhD from Pennsylvania State University. He did his postdoc work at the University of Western Ontario and the Montreal Neurological Institute. His recent work has focused on the development of the prefrontal cortex and how neurons of the cerebral cortex change in response to various pre- and postnatal development factors, including hormones, experience, stress, psychoactive drugs, neurotropins, noise, injury, and how these are all related to adult behavior in laboratory animals and young children. He's published 7 books, including 2 textbooks with Ian Wishaw. I think we still use those for undergrads. Brian can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure we're still using them in the course. And over 425 articles and chapters. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and an officer of the Order of Canada. He has 4 honorary degrees from UBC, Concordia, Thompson Rivers, and Lethbridge, and is the past president of the Canadian Society for Brain, Behavior, and Cognitive Science, and the past president of the Experimental Division of the Canadian Psychological Association. So all of that said, Brian's lecture is going to be titled Adaptability in the Brain That Changes Itself. Take it away, Brian. Oh, Brian, you're muted there. We got to unmute you.
See that? Okay. We're working all right. When I was given the title Adaptability in the Brain That Changes, I decided to talk about the brain that changes itself. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this wonderful event. As I reflect upon my own life, I can say when I completed my BSc in 1968 at the University of Calgary, I had no idea what I was going to do. It was definitely not planned out, and it turned out to be a surprise, even to me. My MSc in animal behavior was devoted to the study of learning behavior in squirrels and chipmunks. In 2020, this may seem a little odd, but you had to have been there. Certainly my parents didn't think this was going to be a career. I've been studying the brain since 1970 when I began my PhD at Penn State University. Believe it or not, that's 50 years ago. Been a great career, but the sun is setting, and so this is getting close to being my last lecture, but hopefully not. I want to focus on one concept, however, that has shaped my career over those 50 years. One of the most intriguing aspects of the brain of all animals, including us, is that it's capable of changing itself. So if you think about when you first took music lessons or tennis lessons, you feel like it's your first day in rehab class. You're being asked to make movements and to do things that you really think are impossible. But after hundreds of hours of practice, it's effortless. So what happened? Well, first we have to understand what I'm going to call the brain hypothesis. You are your brain. Thus, when you do, feel, or think anything, it's your brain that's doing it. Now let's assume you're going to learn to play the guitar or the piano. The left and right hands have 2 different jobs. The fingers have to move quickly, but they have to move in concert with one another. This is a new job for the brain. It has to learn how to make those movements and how to put them together. And to do that, it has to rewire itself. This is called brain plasticity, and it's the key to adaptability. When I completed my BSc in 1968, believe me, it was a different world. There were no personal computers, no internet, no cell phones. Every student had to have access to a typist or a typewriter to prepare term papers, and everything else was done by longhand writing. I got my first computer in the early 1980s. It was a Mac 512. The memory of this beast was 512 kilobytes, not megabytes, not gigabytes. 512 kilobytes is a short paragraph. Nonetheless, this was a big change for my brain to cope with. Incidentally, we had external disk drives. That's how we store stuff. So the skills I learned at the U of C, as good as they were, could not have prepared me for the world I'm in today, or even the world 25 years ago. I've written books in fields that did not exist in 1968. I teach courses that did not exist in 1968 and obviously didn't take the courses that I teach today. In fact, neuroscience didn't really exist in 1968. But I did have skills that would help me, just as you do, by having not as good a level of education as you do, but what passed for it in those days. I took English literature, chemistry, sociology, psychology, math, and so on. And although the fields have changed over the 50, or more than 50 years, since 1968, the fundamental skills of reading complex material, thinking critically, and writing were still there. So my brain, luckily, was able to adapt and change itself to allow me to learn new fields, write books, and at the same time cope with aging. Now, I want to say quite seriously, my brain at age 72 is not the same brain as I had at age 22. And my statement that I'm going to stick with is, thank God it's changed, and you'll see where I'm going. When I took my first course on the brain in 1966, virtually everything I learned turned out to be wrong, or at least overly simplified. We knew almost nothing about the organization of the human brain. I'm proud to say that one of the first books that really did attack this issue was the book that I wrote with Ian Wishaw in 1980. We're now working on the 8th edition, and it looks nothing like the 1980 edition. We have learned a lot. And looking back at the original edition, I think, oh, how naive you were. However, we now know that the human brain is a complex network of 86 billion nerves, about an equal number of support cells called glial cells, trillions of connections, and thousands of networks of those connections. Now, here's one of the problems. When the brain is born or being created, it doesn't know what kind of environment it's going to be thrust into. You've heard a lot of different talks today, and the brains of the people that preceded me were thrust into different environments than the one that I've been in. So how did Mother Nature adapt to this? What she did was to say, let's make a brain that's way bigger and way more complex than what we need and get rid of the bits we don't need. So in utero, you made twice as many neurons as you have now, and in my case, more than twice as many. And then after you were born, you started making connections in response to things that were going on in the environment, and you made more than twice as many connections as you were going to need. And then around age 3 to 5, your brain is looking around the world saying, okay, I can change. I don't need all some of these bits. So it gets rid of neurons, which we call pruning, and gets rid of connections that aren't going to be used. One of the times that it's busiest in terms of pruning is adolescence. The brain at the peak of adolescence is jettisoning about 100,000 connections per second. 100,000 are gone, 100,000 are gone, 100,000 are gone. We wonder why adolescents are so difficult. Their brain is changing all the time. The adolescent is inventing themselves by creating a brain that will be them. And this takes time and it takes practice, and it doesn't end with teenagers. It continues well into the 3rd decade, and in men into the 4th decade. I'll come back to this. So how does the brain decide what to get rid of? You couldn't just do it randomly. So a good example is learning a language. Let's suppose you are an infant and you're in an environment in which the language that's spoken around you is Japanese or Korean. You have the ability to discriminate speech sounds in every single language, whether it's a Native American language, a European language, or Korean or Japanese. But you don't hear those languages. And so the brain says, I don't need all those bits that are irrelevant. And so it starts getting rid of the ability to discriminate other sounds. So by age 6 or 8 months, you're losing that ability. Okay, now you're an adult, and let's suppose I'm choosing Japanese and Korean for a reason. You want to learn English. So you have to make discriminations such as the sounds of L and R that are not in those languages. The ability to discriminate these is basically lost. And for some people, they can never learn to do it. I want to give you an example. When I was a graduate student, we had a Korean technician, a wonderful woman, who loved to label everything. So all the closets, all the drawers and everything were labeled. And we came in one day and she had labeled the Bloom closet. Now, the graduate student thought this was hilarious, but we didn't tell her because we didn't want to hurt her feelings. But it illustrated that those labels were there 3 years later when I left. She had never learned to make that discrimination. So here's the deal. The general principle of getting rid of unnecessary neural bits applies to everything we experience or do not experience. So if you're born in the Arctic, and probably if you're born on the prairies, historically, the ability to make fine discriminations of vertical lines, you got a line, is this the same as that or different? is largely irrelevant because the environment is largely rounded and horizontal. It's not vertical. If you're born in New York City, the reverse is true. Studies have shown that the visual environment you grow up in determines the details of your visual acuity later in life. And this is true of all of our senses. The age at which the brain is most plastic is in the first few years of life, roughly from birth to 3 or 4 years, and then again during adolescence, especially early adolescence, when the gonadal hormones are flowing and they're changing the brain. It's a time that we really change in many ways, but it can be perilous. So imagine your brain is making all these changes, and then you decide to interfere by experimenting with drugs. So if you're a 14-year-old and you decide that you're going to experiment with nicotine or cannabis, those drugs, all psychoactive drugs, produce permanent changes in the structure of the brain. And these changes, because they're permanent, persist into adulthood. And so in fact, in the mid-20s, people who've experimented with nicotine, for example, are at risk of being nicotine addicts. And those who've experimented with cannabis are at risk of mental health issues. Now, some of you may have done those things. Don't worry. It's not going to be unfixable. The brain remains adaptable, remains changeable, and these drug effects can still be altered. For any of you who began smoking, not me, luckily, in your teenage years and have tried to quit, you know it's not easy, but the brain can do it. Okay, in order to learn anything, the brain has to change. If you remember anything from this lecture a few days from now, I've actually reached into your brain and changed it. Now, you've just spent 4 or 5 or more years learning stuff, and although you don't recall it all, a lot of the information is retained in our memory. But how does this work? What is memory? Memory is a process whereby objects, information, and even thoughts are represented by networks of neurons in the brain. These networks are formed by experiences. If the networks are lost, memories vanish. It's remarkable that we can have an idea that the brain produces and remember it later. Think what that means. It means that just thinking changed your brain. That's a bit scary because we can think good things or stupid things. And either one can change the brain. But the question that comes to mind here is there a limit to how many of these memories we can have? Is there a limit to how many networks we can form? After all, there's a limit to how many neurons are in the brain. The answer is not likely. Now, why is that? You've only got 86 million neurons. Well, because we're producing networks. So if I have this bottle, I look at it, I can see what it is. There's a group of networks in the brain that says that's a bottle. If I look at a person that I know, a different group of networks says that's Tony, and so on. So you think you have a limited number of networks you can have. You do, except that you can be in many networks. So you could be on a variety of committees or teams with different sets of people, and in fact, perform different functions in each one. So neurons can be in many networks. There's likely a limit, but none of us going to get there. Now, do not see this as an example that we only use 10% of our brain. We use all of our brain. And if you're missing bits, as a neuropsychologist, I should be able to detect that fairly easily. What is true is that we cannot use all the brain at the same time. As I'm talking, the regions of the brain that are involved in producing the movements of speech, the sounds of speech, the words I say, the thinking required to do that, get a lot of blood. Other regions of the brain do not get so much blood. So regions of the brain that might be involved in how my big toe feels, oh, no, I feel the big toe because I've shifted blood there. You see the blood is shifting around. This leads us to the peril of driving and using your cell phone at the same time. Something has to give, and unfortunately, it's usually the driving. Of course, memories can be faulty. Now, why are memories wrong? Why have they failed us? I'm not talking about memories that vanish, but memories that are wrong. Well, one reason for this is that every time we retrieve a memory, it's labile. It can be changed. So I have a memory of something that happened years ago. I'm recalling it now, and it's in a different environment. And so the memory can be affected by things that have gone on. And one of the best examples of this is eyewitness testimony. Here's a problem. You're walking down the street and you witness an accident between 2 vehicles. And so the police arrive and you go and tell them, I actually witnessed this so I can give you a statement. And they say, you know, there's a lot going on here. there's people injured and so on. Give us your phone number and we'll give you a call tomorrow and we can talk about it. Okay. So they do. And they ask a question about the speed of the vehicle. And then they ask it in two ways. One way may be, when you saw car A smash into car B, how fast was it going? Or they may say, when you saw car A bump into car B, how fast was it going? The answer that you give is biased by the verb that the questioner used. And so you make an estimate. Let's say in one case it was fast, maybe 60 kilometers an hour, and the other one 15. Okay, now that has now changed your memory of the event. So when you're in court, let's say 6 months later, and the question is, can you tell us how fast car A was going? Your answer is biased by the question you were asked 6 months earlier. So your memory has been altered by experiences that occurred around that memory. Now, here's a problem. All of us have friends who have bad memories. We don't, they do. We've had joint events, joint experiences. I can tell you that Ian Wishaw and I, over 50 years of friendship, have had a lot of joint experiences and we don't agree on a lot of the material that we experienced. So why is that? Well, I could argue that he has bad memory or that I have a wonderful memory, but there's another way of looking at this. There's a wonderful little book written by Sir Frederick Bartlett in 1932. He concluded that true memories do not really exist. True memories do not really exist. Memory rather is the process of constructing what is likely to have occurred based on your experiences. Now I can tell you in marking exams, and I see a lot of this, it's not always pretty and not always encouraging for professor. Students will give you answers and then defend their answer saying, you said that in class, I wrote it down. I'm going to say, no, I did not say that in class. You may have written it down, but your memory is faulty. Another more topical example perhaps can be seen by a certain politician in the USA. His construction of what is happening and what has happened can be quite surprising as he constructs the world. Now, how do these changes to produce memory occur? It's one thing to say, well, we've got these changes in the brain, but they don't occur magically. There must be some way, some mechanism. It's all about the connection between neurons, which is called the synapse. You've got trillions of synapses, and the synapses are complicated, and the way they change to form memories is really complicated, not totally understood, but the principle is really simple. Synapses can change their shape, their size, their molecular properties. They can come, they can go, and so on. And so new synapses can be formed, new networks can be formed. Okay, how's that done? Well, the changes are controlled by gene expression. So genes can be turned on and off in neurons. This process known as epigenetics. So as we learn to play a musical instrument or learn a new language, there are a lot of synaptic changes, but they don't happen instantly. All those changes in gene expression and network construction takes time and practice. I have to confess that I'm often discouraged by why I cannot change the mind of students in my classes about some of their rather, in my view, surprising ideas. I recall that when I first started teaching neuropsychology here in 1977, students objected, many students, not all, objected to the idea that mental illness was about the brain. They were convinced it was about something else because mental illness is not biology. They didn't buy the brain hypothesis. Remember, just thinking changes the brain. So if you're thinking depressing thoughts, you're changing the brain. I once testified in court about a young woman who had been a fashion model. She was beautiful still, but she had a serious brain injury in which she had been riding on the back of a motorcycle, and a motor vehicle did not notice the motorcycle and turned into the motorcycle intersection. The effect of this was that a neurosurgeon had to take gravel out of her brain. This was a nasty accident. I explained to the judge that she would never be able to hold a job, have close relationships, and so on. But they stopped me and said, "Are we talking about the same person? She sure looks good to me." Well, I said, yes, she does look good, but I'm talking to her about her brain. I'm not talking about the outside of her. He wasn't having any part of this. He did not understand the brain hypothesis, and he wasn't going to learn it. I've spoken to him many years later. He's got it now, or I think you've got it. Getting people to change their mind takes a lot of repetition, just like changing to learn other things. So let's return to my 22 versus 72-year-old brain. If you ask most people over 40 when they became who they are, they'll say somewhere around 30, females a little earlier than males. This means that most of you are still inventing your brain. If we jump ahead to people my age, there's little doubt that my processing speed is slower than yours. My memory is not as good for some types of information, but I hope you don't see me as demented. I confess that when I was 22, I rather suspected that anybody who was over 50 was done, and certainly somebody who was 72 was well past it. Luckily, my brain has changed. So back to my original point. Your brain will be different in 25 or 50 years as you adapt to technology we can't even imagine. I remember watching the moon landing in 1969 with my grandmother, who was born in about 1885. She commented that when she was a little girl, cars had not even been invented. And now she was watching Neil Armstrong land on the moon. This was nearly beyond her comprehension. But she adapted to the 20th century, and you will to those in this century. One important question is whether there are ways to enhance the adaptability of the brain, and the answer is yes. We've heard some of this today already. Learning new languages, including music, makes the brain more plastic later in life. We are social creatures. We require social interaction to maintain plasticity. In the absence of social interaction, we begin to get confused. Exercise is crucial because it increases blood flow in the brain, and this increased blood flow is needed to make molecular changes required to change synapses. We can also change the world through thought. So by putting electrodes in our brain and using wireless technologies, we can actually control machines. We can control robots just by thinking about what we want them to do. In fact, there are studies showing that one rat can control the behavior of another rat just by thinking. Again, they're connected wirelessly one to the other in one way, obviously. We have only a basic idea of how this works, but it demonstrates just how plastic our brain can be. If this really were my last lecture, I would want to leave you with the knowledge that you are your brain and it will change itself over time. Your job is to make sure it changes well. Good luck and congratulations. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Bryan, for that last lecture. I don't want this to be biased because I do know Bryan a lot better than the other speakers. And I want to say this is true of all the speakers today, that I hope I have many conversations with them in the future now as colleagues and learn from them. But I have to say, Bryan, every time I hear you speak or have a conversation with these things, you're constantly, I won't say blowing my mind, but I'm learning something new every time I get to interact with you. I feel like whether that's words of wisdom on how to proceed on something at work, or whether that's something about the brain and the development of the brain. I think you hit the nail on the head when you focused on sort of, and it's similar to some of the previous topics, that things that you didn't know existed, you had to learn later, and your brain made those connections. And I really, for me, part of it, having an 8-year-old at home, was I really liked the part where you focused on these children and the amount of, like 1 million every second happening. And maybe that might be why their attitudes are so, difficult to deal with sometimes. So that in mind, I think I can open the floor to any questions people might have. So again, if you have questions for Bryan, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And if none pop up, I have tons. So I can ask Bryan questions all day about his career and his research. So I'll just get started, I guess. So, you discussed the recollection that you and Ian always have when you remember things you experienced together. How long, like your example in your talk mentioned sort of that change can happen, it can be influenced right away by a question that's asked. So I guess I'm sure my wife is listening to this too, so she'll probably give me crap for this later, but I don't mean this to be any kind of a bad parallel, but sometimes like you and Ian have worked together a long time, so there is that kind of parallel to a marriage. And married couples do this all the time where they recall that memory or that conversation slightly differently. Would that be because it influences later, or is it just any numerous multitude of reasons that recollection could be different?
Well, there's going to be more than one reason. A lot of it can be influences that occurred at the same time, or influences that occurred later, for sure. But you've also had different experiences throughout the months or years from whenever that event occurred, and you may have brought that memory up independently, and it gets changed. And every time we bring it up, it gets changed again. So the more you bring it up, the more it gets changed.
So what about your attitude towards the thing you experience? So like if we experience something and then I think about it as we experience it in my head and have that thought, which you said adapts my brain a bit, does that, and she thinks about it slightly different than me, will that change our recollection of the memory later?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's scary.
Yeah, it really is.
But it's a good thing to know so that we're not so critical of our partners.
Yes. Well, and it's, yeah, it's kind of interesting because again, one of the things we talked about in the earlier talks afterwards, I think it was Janae, we brought up the idea of voices and how important that is towards EDI. And I know there's EDI training about, for your perspective, but your mind still thinks things, right? So that if you have that thought, it's hard to train it not to. Interesting. So Peter Kai says, Dr. Kolb, why are good questions sometimes more important than good answers?
I think, and I will tell my students that the most important thing that they can learn from is questions. So it's really about the questions, not the answers, because the answers will change. But I'll hear a talk, and I heard 7 others today, and one thing that goes through my mind was, I never even thought about the question that they were addressing. Some of the stuff Don was addressing just blew my mind away. I'd never thought about any of those sort of concepts. So the questions really get us thinking. And I really think that the questions are actually often more important than the answers. When I'm teaching and students ask questions, often I go, wow, we don't have the same glasses on. I need to put their glasses on to try and get a sense of how they're seeing this. So I think that's why questions are so important.
We have another question here that says, thank you for the nice presentation. How would someone overcome stress in a short time period? So I guess that, I don't know, a little bit in the background, maybe that's a way to like overcome, if you've gone through a stressful situation, how could you start to immediately adapt your brain and fix it?
Well, I mean, psychologists will give you all sorts of answers, but one of the key things, I think, especially in these times, is exercise and being outside and just experiencing the world. The solution is not going to be from Valium necessarily, or from alcohol, but rather from interaction with other people. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a talking therapy. It's a psychotherapy of sorts, but it's the one that's most common now. And it can be quite effective. And that can be my talking to you, my talking to somebody else, and so on, and just talking it out, not keeping it inside.
Okay, I have one more. There's no questions in the panel, but I have one. So, you talked about brain plasticity a bit and the idea that, you have to do things throughout your life to, keep it active and growing so that you can, your brain functioning can last longer. So is there any kind of age, this might be a hard question to answer, but is there an age at which the brain can't change itself?
No, I can't change my brain as fast as you can, and you can't change your brain as fast as your 8-year-old can. But until dementia begins, severe senescence, the brain will still change. So it slows down, it doesn't change as fast, but it still changes.
So there are things you can do, like, you mentioned these positive things. For example, I have a history of Alzheimer's and dementia in my family. So, I've always told myself I'm going to always read a book and keep myself. Is there things you recommend people do to keep that healthy brain throughout life?
Right. So one of the things that I've started doing again is I learned to play the guitar as a teenager, and then I played on and off over the years. When I heard a lecture about how important music and musical training was to keeping your brain flexible, I started playing a lot and learning new things. I told my wife about this, and she's now playing the piano again. Now, I don't think I caused it, but that's one thing. The other thing is social interaction. I worry that older people will, especially now in these times, be self-isolating because they have to, but the social interaction is critical. I recall that when my dad was put in respite care to give my mom a break, he had Parkinson's, he was fine. And after 3 days, basically social isolation, he didn't know where he was or why he was there. I mean, it's really scary. So the social interaction and the exercise and the things like music are critical.
Okay, well, with that said, I don't think there's any more. Is there any more questions from the audience? And I haven't gotten any more. So I think, thank you again, Bryan, for the wonderful last lecture. I guess this draws us to the conclusion of our series.